Hi, I'm Kyle Stoker, and I'm encouraging you to vote in the IACA elections. So make sure you go to the IACA website and vote because our membership has a voice in who leads the organization, and you want to make sure that your voice is heard. Thank you very much.
Welcome to Analyst Talk with Jason Elder. It's like coffee with an analyst, or it could be whiskey with an analyst reading a spreadsheet, linking crime events, identifying a series, and getting the latest scoop on association news and training. So please don't beat that analyst and join us as we define the law enforcement analysis profession one episode at a time.
How we doing, analysts? Jason Elder here with another LEA podcast deep dive. Before You Leap with Randy Stickley, the show on critical thinking in law enforcement analysis. And with me, as always, is Randy Stickley. Randy, how we doing?
I am good, man. How about you?
All right, I am doing well. It's September, the weather's breaking a little bit, getting into the fall weather, just going with the flow, I guess.
Yeah, no, I was actually quite surprised the last, I would say, 2.5, 3 weeks. It's been in the 80s and 90s here, but it's not 80s and 90s with 110, 115 degree heat index. So I'm darn near ready to crack out my coats.
Oh, man. All right. What are we talking about today?
Well, I'm going to take a little divergence from staunchly talking about the critical thinking aspects. There is a basis of critical thinking that goes into this. But one of the things that we've talked about before was in our situations in the analytic profession that sometimes we get into analytic blunders, maybe indecision, collaborative breakdowns, or what have you. You should go back and think on your thinking and think on your training. Well, I actually wanted to peel the onion a little bit on that and actually have folks remember there are more training opportunities out there than maybe those they were afforded before they were hired with an agency or organization, as opposed to after the fact. One of the biggest things, and again, we've talked about this before, I have a pretty extensive training background. I go and talk to different groups of analysts, universities, and even at conferences on the needs for training and to give critical thinking training. So I think it's important for us today to talk about how analysts should capitalize on some of those training opportunities as we move forward.
Yeah, I agree. Well, training's always near and dear to my heart when it comes to law enforcement analysis. I think it's critical, and there's so much out there. And you talked about experienced analysts, but I know it's really like fire hydrant to the face for new analysts trying to identify what the best training is and getting the most return on their investment for time and effort.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of my biggest epitaphs that I'll give analysts of all levels is that no one's going to be your biggest cheerleader but yourself. And ultimately, one of the ways that you can really put some points on the old scoreboard while you're being that cheerleader is to go through training. And to kind of segue into that, I wanted to make a little announcement. I've talked about it on my LinkedIn and a couple different social media platforms, but I was actually recently elected to the International Association of Law Enforcement Intelligence Analysts DC Metro Chapter Board as their director of training.
Oh, congratulations.
So, yeah, thanks, bud. Thank you. I appreciate that. And one of the biggest things for me right now is to kind of enhance and diversify some of those training opportunities for folks that are in that DC Metro chapter. I mean, when I took the interim position, we had another great director of training for a while, and she came to me. She had a significant amount of critical thought that went into this. She said, "Hey, I've got a lot on my plate right now. Can't really devote a lot of bandwidth to this. I know you have that background. Would you mind stepping into this role until elections come up?" So it was admittedly just throughout the summer.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, sure, I'd be happy to do it, because I ultimately use my critical thinking to kind of take some stuff off of my plate. Because again, it's not a matter of willpower, it's a matter of physics at that point. So one of the things that I worked with the former director on was getting what we called the summer series Analyst 101 training off the ground. Effectively, that summer series, and for those that haven't gone through it, it was to be basically a scene setter, kind of an appetizer for folks that wanted to pursue their foundations of intelligence analysis training or their FIAT, to ultimately get ready for their criminal intelligence certified analyst distinction from IALEIA Global. So we kind of mirrored the lesson plans that were set out with FIAT, giving folks the ins and outs of being an analyst in, I'd say, hour to hour and a half kind of bites once a week throughout the summer, covering things like what is the intel cycle? What does it mean to be an analytic thinker, types of thinking, indicators of change, things of that nature to get folks ready for future learning and certification. But since then, we touched, I'd say, hundreds of analysts in our chapter, and as well as beyond, we opened it up to the folks on the national side as well. But since election, we've kind of had to pen out what do we want to do in our positions as board members. And one of my big ones is, okay, we had success with this. We haven't really done this kind of webinar-based training of that magnitude before. I'd like to keep the ball rolling. So we're probably going to start conducting these Analyst 101s on a semi-annual basis, maybe twice a year. But we have lots of new initiatives where we want to bring in folks that talk about trends, topics, and emerging threats that may be pertinent to some of our membership and beyond. But then also have these opportunities and roundtables where we kind of do what we're doing here, not necessarily in a podcast format, but kind of having akin it to when you go on YouTube and you have those, I think it's Vanity Fair, which is odd enough that I watch that, but they have roundtables of like directors, writers, actors. They just kind of have casual conversation back and forth about their craft, how they do what they do, and so on. So we want to bring stuff like that, as well as doing more outreach. I think, Jason, the first time you and I met, I was at a conference, and we want to talk about that as well, getting more consortiums, educational outreach, and et cetera, bringing in more of that kind of student piece so we can have more student members who ultimately would, hopefully, I should say, parlay their memberships into actual memberships with IALEIA so they could become those folks that are connected to that wider kind of professional pool.
So that's a lot. So I recommend to anybody that's fairly new, take the FIAT. That's a very foundations, basic training for analysts. So I think there's a lot there to learn. And then what is your thoughts on the certification for analysts? Because I feel I've always been a little bit on the fence about certification just because there's not just one certification. There's so many different certifications. And is it good to just have one, or is it you going to get bogged down if you're trying to get too many? What is your thoughts?
I'm not going to elaborate on the thoughts of having too many. I try to limit how many letters are after my name on an email line. But I think it's important for folks. I know it's kind of great, kind of, well, no kidding, Randy, for me to say, I think it's great to have certifications, especially in this profession. And I should say, I had to stop myself there for a second because there's a couple ways to look at that. You have certifications for certification name only in this profession, which it's great for folks to have PMPs and whatnot. Not saying PMPs aren't important, but if you're doing day-to-day analytic work and dealing with law enforcement, military, other types of federal officials and what have you, it behooves you to have more of those credentials that back you that say, I know the methodology inside and out. I can tell you the intel cycle, but I could also tell you how that intel cycle applies to every facet of this project that we've worked on. Because I think one of the things that many analysts, and I actually had this conversation with one of my analysts here recently, was we worked on this project and the conversation piece came up of, well, we won't have to, it's not like we're going to have to testify. And it's like, oh, you really think that? And you could have heard a pin drop. It's like, wait, what? So when you get into that testimonial piece, if you're brought into court, it looks better that you're the expert on that analytic component as opposed to, well, I've got 18 certifications in other fields. Okay, but you're a crime analyst, intelligence analyst, analytic professional. Where's your credentials on this? So it adds that level of professionalism. It adds that level of expertise and experience. But that's not to say that you stop at just the CICA, or the criminal intelligence one that I just referenced. There's a myriad of them out there. And this is one of those times where I'll say, relate it back to critical thinking. It would behoove any analyst supervisor, manager, or any law enforcement executive above that to pay attention to. And there's this idea in the certification world, you have folks that are true certification houses for professionals, for the practitioners. But then you have others, it's like, okay, you pay $3,000 for the learning materials, $2,000 for the pre-test or the kind of sample test, and then $5,000 for the certification once you get it. That's a lot of money, and a lot of those folks, they get the pejorative view of being a certification mill. You pay enough money, anyone can have that distinction. We really want to be careful of that. So it would behoove folks to read between the lines and pay attention to certifications that matter to them. For example, I have my SECA, but then I also have certifications in like cyber intelligence, which relates to open source. I think there's a cyber investigator one that I have under my nameplate. And then I have an economic and forensics kind of background. That's purely because a lot of the casework and material that I've worked with in the past had a nexus to money. I mean, that's kind of the shocker of the century, right? Crime has a nexus to money. So it behooved me to have that financial certification as well. So maybe stick to stuff that's in your area or your topic load. That's another area to look at, but pay close attention to some of those ones where it's like, okay, you're going to pay to play, you're going to pay to have it, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And I do feel that they're not all certifications have the same weight. They're not all built the same, and you're not going to get the same thing out of them. I would encourage analysts, and this goes for training, not just for certification, just all training, is look for opportunities in the training where it's hands-on or it's technical or it's beyond just a talking head lecture. I know anybody that listens to my podcast regularly are probably tired of me saying that because it's one of my soapboxes. But I think that's one of the pitfalls, I think, for law enforcement analysis training is this idea that like training, you go, you fill a room and it's a lecture and you get a little bit of awareness, you get some networking, and then you come home, and I'm not exactly sure what you're coming home with.
You nailed it on the head. And that technical component is one of the things that I would increasingly harp on folks to go for. And this is not me talking as a director of training. This is me talking as the analytic professional now. One of the things that I had to kind of lock in on with my current role is SQL script writing and code writing. And I told myself for years, I will not get into that. I found that so mind-numbing and repetitive. But then it became a necessity with what our team currently works on. We have a couple folks that are fantastic script writers and automators, but with the volume that we work in, it almost behooved to have that kind of person in reserves that it's like, oh crap, those two guys are down. Hey, batter 3, you're up. So I pursued some extra learning, and it's not a certification per se, it's just a graduate certificate, which is completely different than getting a certification. But it's a graduate certificate in SQL and how to use it for data science purposes. And I'll tell you, I find it fascinating, and it's a skill that I can use, but it was one that was out of necessity and out of the greater good and the need for our team as well.
Yeah, I think that's what's tough though too, and because I remember looking back on the training that I took over my decade as an analyst. Of course, this was right after 9/11, so the training was fast and furious type of thing. I mean, there was so much training in the aughts, but there was some that was tough. I remember taking like a data recovery class, and I was like, well, I don't know if the future will present me with an opportunity to get into computer forensics. And it ultimately didn't, but at the time I didn't know that. It was just something that I was like, okay, I'm going to take this, learn some technical skills. And maybe this is going to be a good return on investment. Maybe it's not. And I think in hindsight, turned out not to be, but it's really difficult to predict the future.
Oh God, no. I mean, for God's sakes, I'm an analyst, not a fortune teller, man.
Yeah.
A rip on Bones McCoy, right? But
Mhm.
you never can tell. And I always tell folks when I was a trainer and then when I go still speak at colleges and conferences that you're never worse off for learning a new nugget of information, especially whenever you're in a holistic environment such as the analytic profession. You never know when, in your case, Jason, when that digital forensics aspect is going to come up, which in a world where everything is data on data on data, it's probably paying off in dividends for you somewhere.
Yeah. No, I mean it's just some are more than others, right? And you just don't know. And I do feel that because there's so much different training out there and so many different options.
Right.
You talked about the money aspect of it. I mean, most of the time, a lot of agencies don't have money to throw out that, or maybe the individual analyst wants to spend their own money to do some of these trainings. And so I think it's a lot to put on the analyst because it is a little bit of the wild, wild west because there's not just this like, oh, it's not like the bar exam, for instance, or any of the other maybe national certifications for like accountants or whatever it is. Like there's not one recipe that I could say, okay, go do these 25 trainings and then you're going to be set for life.
Yeah, and that's a really good segue to another point that I had is by no means am I going to be the end all be all on every training that is available. That's almost maddening in today's world because there's hundreds, if not thousands of folks, solo, one man, mom and pop little training groups or large collectives that do this type of training. But I think it's important for folks to understand, particularly our analysts, that they understand there's a lot out there and that some of it is low to no cost when it comes to attending, getting those maybe continuing education credits, or building up those hours of training to pursue one of those certifications that we were talking about. Again, sitting in the role that I do with the DC Metro Chapter, I'd be remiss to talk about IALEIA. IALEIA in and of itself, they have multiple training opportunities, different types of webinars, different types of speakers and engagements. I actually, another hat that I wear is I still work with the what they call the emerging professionals group, kind of acting as their senior advisor on, basically being the graybeard, which I was kind of annoyed when I was told I was going to be the graybeard because I'm not that old. But they have great lunch and learn opportunities. I've spoke at one of them, or spoken. There's my West Virginian English coming out. I've spoken at a couple of those where I was talking to a group of hungry, eager analysts that wanted to learn. And that's fantastic, mostly newer folks to the profession.
Mm-hmm.
But beyond that, they have things like FIAT, the Foundations of Intel Analysis training that Jason talked about and I talked about. You have 40 hours of back to basics. Here's exactly what this profession looks like. And when you talk about FIATs, for example, there's another firm that teaches the very similar FIAT, which is NW3C, the folks that I used to be employed with. They have a slew of educational opportunities and that are free for law enforcement professionals across the nation that cover everything from financial crimes, high-tech crimes, prosecutorial, if anybody wants to dip their toe into the lawyer pool, God help you. But then also the Intel spot, which is where I spent a lot of my time helping develop that program, get it going. They had their FIAT kind of operating in lockstep with IALEIA's FIAT, but then they took it a step further and started teaching courses on analytic writing, strategic analysis, link analysis, and I actually still know a few folks that work there. They actually have one now on kind of like analytic methodology and thinking. So highly encourage folks, if you have those law enforcement credentials, to pursue that avenue as well. Another great opportunity or series of opportunities, the Hetherington Group. Cynthia Hetherington has a bunch of those types of online learning modules. She actually has a endeavor that she has that is called the OSIN Academy. I was actually privileged to go through that endeavor as well. That has grown into its own kind of monolith of open source kind of investigation techniques and education. But another one that's a sleeper, and I think many folks don't pay too much attention to, is Coursera. And this is not me talking with an endorsement. I'm not wearing a Coursera polo on this one. But this is one where there is an amount of cost to it, because I think you pay like $40 a month for a subscription, which again, yeah, there's that monetary concept, but $40 to an agency for a year might be doable. And if not, the analyst may encumber some of that cost, but it's also cancelable at any point in time. But that's actually where I got my sequel graduation credit. And I did it through UC Davis, and it was it was kind of self-paced. They have all those lessons there for you. It was hands-on. I actually was able to write some scripts and write code, as opposed to have a learned professional talking to me from my magic computer that sits on my desk. So I highly encourage folks to do those types of opportunities, simply because they show you, as I said earlier, new trends, tactics, or skills. And those skills, and remember I said the biggest cheerleader for yourself, the analyst, is going to be yourself. But that marketability, if you're an analyst that starts out in one shop and you have an opportunity to move to another shop or move to another agency or organization, that sets you apart. You may have folks that have those skills, but do they have the analytic background combined with that technical background as well, or whatever that particular topic or area of expertise that you're pursuing through your education? But if you're staying within your agency, depending on how large they are, and it should be completely regardless of the size of the agency or the organization, but there is that promotional aspect. You took the initiative, you went through this training, you demonstrated dedication to the craft and so on. So that, for yourself, you may actually have a distinction from going from the journeyman analyst to, let's say, Intel Analyst 1, which is fantastic for some folks. You bump up. And if that's part of your career objectives or your trajectory, wholeheartedly, that's the way to go about it. But I would say one other thing, and I referenced this earlier as well, conferences. Many people see conferences as opportunities just to get away from the office for a little bit. Not really a vacation, because you're still there doing work and partnering with folks and discussing work, but it's a great opportunity for learning. I've been to many a conference in my time. That's actually how you and I kind of got connected, through all of our conversations. Jason, I think it was IACA in Chicago?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, I believe so. And all of those trainings, I mean, they're crafted by professionals for the sake of continuing education and all of those aspects that I just talked about. But it's not just the training that comes into play here. Yes, it shows initiative. Yes, you're representing your agency, but you're representing yourself. And when you represent yourself, you're building greater potential for those partnerships, for that collaborative effort, for that networking. I'm all about the networking. I love building contacts, liaisons, and friends across the nation, because you never know when you're going to need assistance from insert organization here. It always behooves you to make a contact. Let's say you meet John Smith from Texas, who has a gang and narcotics aspect, part of their kind of Rolodex of their area of responsibility. You're running into something that may have run along the Southwest border. It's like, now, if only I met somebody at one of these conferences that covers this. I know I'll pick up the phone. Well, not pick up the phone. I'll get on my keyboard and write an email and ask John, hey, does he have anything on this? So it builds that larger analytic community, and you're going to learn through that as well. Everything's a learning opportunity in my eyes. Maybe that's what makes me such a fervent educator. I'm always trying to learn something new, and I learn stuff every day by talking with folks. So I think that gives you that opportunity as well. But even if you're not attending as a traditional attendee, there are opportunities at these conferences to speak and actually get up on the podium and share some of the stuff that you've done. Or maybe there's an alternative view or technique that you work with that maybe the other thousands of agencies that could potentially attend these conferences may not. So it's a great opportunity for you to speak for yourself, as well as demonstrate all of those credentials and all of that fine education that you, the analyst, have gone throughout your career, and demonstrate that prowess, which ultimately lends itself to further education, because people are going to come to you with questions, or they're going to say, I actually have a different view of that, which is great, because guess what? You're learning still. And I find that all such a cool symbiotic living process as part of that whole kind of analytic learning endeavor.
Yeah. Graybeards may want you to pick up the phone and talk to them. So,
I love it.
So you might need to know your audience and whether you're texting, keyboarding, or calling.
Fair point.
So the one thing I would add to all of this, and maybe you could make an argument this isn't quite training, but look for opportunities within your city for networking and educational experiences. Some examples are if a department in your city is having an open house, maybe waterworks or planning is having some kind of open house. That might be a great opportunity to go in there and meet those folks, and because you never know when you might need them in a pinch. I would say one of the things that I did a while back was I was part of the Citizens Fire Academy, which was a great experience for me. So I think, and maybe if you're an analyst that's is assigned to a particular jurisdiction, a lot of people always talk on the podcast about getting out from under your desk and going out and seeing the world and seeing that jurisdiction. So if there's community events or if there's something important going on in that particular area, take that opportunity to go out and just observe it for yourself.
Yeah. And I'll say that to kind of compound your point. Many of us in this profession, I've heard you talk at conferences, I've heard you speak in person. I know you make the joke of, I'm not much of a public speaker, and there you go, knocking it out of the park. I would almost say you and I are kind of weird black sheep to the profession because we don't mind putting ourselves out there, talking to folks, learning, and kind of building that conversation. You have, by and large, a larger percentage of folks in this profession who they don't have that confidence. And we've talked about this before, about how critical thinking builds that confidence. But just seeing that you have other folks that are doing effectively the same voodoo that you do so well are getting up there and speaking, getting up there, putting themselves, exposing themselves within reason to this wider analytic collective, it almost builds kind of that confidence in you to say, well, maybe I should take a run at this next year. Or maybe, like you said, put myself out there if another agency within my jurisdiction or in a neighboring jurisdiction is having a symposium or having an open house, to put the best foot forward and start building those bridges. Like I said, I see value in all of it. I think it's all a worthwhile endeavor just to put yourself out there and be part of those types of events.
Very good. And we're going to put links to all the information that Randy and I have talked about today. So be sure to check out the show notes for additional information. All right, Randy, let's just sum up this like we always do. Before you leap, you should what?
Before you leap, you should remember your training opportunities.
Nice. And just real quick before we say goodbye, Superman or Fantastic Four?
Ooh. Die-hard Marvel guy here. You're testing me. But I'm going to say Superman was pretty good.
All right. That's interesting. I did like Fantastic Four better than Superman, but that's going to have to be a conversation offline.
Absolutely.
All right, Randy, until next time, think before you leap.
Yep. Thanks for having me, Jason.
Thank you for making it to the end of another episode of Analyst Talk with Jason Elder. You can show your support by sharing this and other episodes found on our website at www.leapodcasts.com. If you have a topic you would like us to cover or have a suggestion for our next guest, please send us an email at leapodcasts@gmail.com. Till next time, analysts, keep talking.